The Vietnam War was a great debate during its time, and even when the decision was cast about going to war, not even its end could settle the dust between the people for it and against it. It's one of the most hotly debated subjects in history, and even to this day people wonder and ask about the what ifs. What if the war had ended earlier? What if we decided to push on through and see if we could win the war? These questions are asked every time the Vietnam War is discussed, and we truly wonder how our decisions affect the rest of the world. And thus starts the great debate, the Vietnam War, successes, failures, and consequences. The United States in the 1960s. The US is currently fighting in the North and South Vietnam. The war started with the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong wanting to overthrow the South in favor of a communist country. Fighting on the north side was the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, while on the south side was the US, Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand.
The way that we got involved in the war to the extent we were in later years was kind of an evolutionary thing. We started off providing assistance in terms of small teams of individuals going over to train the South Vietnamese soldiers, and then it simply escalated and escalated. It was one of those things that never really had a start. It just kind of built up.
It really, I think, was the domino theory. The fact that communism anywhere was a threat to us in the United States, and that's what led us to try and support South Vietnam.
The US got involved with the war because we did not want another communist country to ally with the Soviet Union, this being the time of the Cold War. Though the split between North and South Vietnam was growing, there was also another split forming inside the United States itself. It was a split between pro-war people and anti-war people, or, in their different names, hawks and doves, and none since the Civil War had any war created such a great divide.
The nation just seemed to be torn apart by it. There were protests on every college campus. Every night in the news we saw conflicts between people who were, for the war and people against the war.
I was a historian by training. It was an interesting experience. That's why I decided to go join the Army, to see it for myself. I didn't have an opinion about what was right or wrong. It was what it was. It was a war. A lot of them are terribly different, but in some of the essentials they're terribly the same. So I wasn't particularly politicized.
The anti-war people did not gain momentum until 1965, 10 years after the war started. This is most likely due to Operation Rolling Thunder, where the US used fighting attack bombers against the North. The people against the war at the time were college students and high school students creating peace walks and rallies. The SDS, or Students for a Democratic Society, was formed during these years and were the biggest anti-war activist group during the time. But a few years earlier, a major supporter and icon for the anti-war movement was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was involved with the war because most of the men being drafted were a part of a minority group. This helped both anti-war efforts and civil rights efforts because both would gather attention from being so closely related.
If you were white and had a lot of money, you probably didn't have to go. You could go to college. If you were a person of color and no money, you probably win.
One of the biggest protests that the SDS organized was a gathering around the Washington Monument, in which 250,000 Americans participated. Another factor that helped the anti-war effort was the major increase in men that were being drafted into the war, especially men 18 years of age. To fight against this, underground railroads into Canada and other places of safety from the military were developed. The war was taking a hefty toll on President Johnson, as well as the people. That made it all much easier for the election of President Nixon in 1968. He claimed he was beginning the end of the war in Vietnam. Though the anti-war influence that took down President Johnson's powers in office were still there and waiting to do the same for Nixon. Finally, on July 8th, 800 American troops were withdrawn from Vietnam. The first withdrawal out of a 14-stage plan set to end November 1972. This did not stop the anti-war movement, however. Another attempt to gain the attention of President Nixon was the M-Day protest, where all over America groups of people voiced their concerns about the war. The total number of protesters this day was estimated at about 1 million. 500,000 gathered outside the White House, another 250,000 in New York City, and in Boston Common, a public park in Boston, Massachusetts, 100,000 people gathered. Not to mention the other 150,000 Americans all over showing a great desire for the war to end. Tensions between the Doves and the Hawks worsened. In May 1970, National Guardsmen shot and killed 4 protesters at Kent State University. The Doves made a strong response to this as 400 universities shut down and hundreds of thousands of protesters surrounded government buildings.
That really got even the Hawks, the people that wanted the war, were saying, wait a minute, let's rethink this.
In March 1973, the last of the American troops were withdrawn from Vietnam, yet the war wasn't quite over yet. The war could finally be called over for America when in 1975, Operation Frequent Wind was put into action and the evacuation of Vietnamese in South Vietnam. This was an effort to save the people in South Vietnam that supported us in our goal to stop the communist takeover. Using floods of helicopters going back and forth on 2 landing vessels named Hancock and Midway, Operation Frequent Wind managed to save the lives of 125,000 Vietnamese.
All reality, the relocation, there was no choice. Contrary to what's going on right now in the immigration area, I think that was one of the things that we owed them big time, because they invested their lives.
The main goal at the start of the war was to try and stop another communist country from sprouting up and fueling the fire of the Cold War. Yet in the end, it became too much for us and we had to back out. There are many causes to why this happened, one being it just seemed unwinnable and no end in sight. Another was that America could not afford financially to stay in with all the troops, bombs, and fighter planes needed. Yet one factor standing out most of all was the pure power and voice of American citizens. What once became students and teens protesting on street corners grew into public opinion, and the people gathering together in their massive amounts to voice their disapproval.
The American people once they invest soldiers' lives, want to win. The problem with Vietnam and a counter-guerrilla war is that there's never any clear measure of what victory is. It's something that's not as tangible and not as easy to define.
I don't think anybody really felt like this little bitty country on the other side of the world was any threat to America, so it was just a waste of war.
I don't think anybody remembers anything. I really don't think they do. History is only relevant if you remember and use it. Some of the lessons are inconvenient. I think veterans remember it because they were there. Some people remember it because they lost friends. I doubt that much is learned from the given war, even by the military. They seem to make the same mistakes under different conditions.
The successes of the Vietnam War was the realization of how much power the general people had and how much their right to protest managed to affect the rest of the country. Though this was a small success compared to the amount of failures. One was the war had a great financial toll on the country and inflation rates shot up as America was trying to get back to normal, though the nation would not get back to normal for a great amount of time, because even with the war ended, the split between the people and their government was vast, and it took some time to repair it. And a democracy with such a vast split between the people and its government can hardly be called a democracy at all.